practice session.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Broom, and I'm running the meeting this afternoon. I called a meeting to order, and we're waiting for our outside experts to come on the line to begin a discussion with them. So please bear with us for a few minutes. One of the pieces of information you previously provided, Doug, was how many other jurisdictions have already debruced, and where are we really in that process? Is about 75% of all governmental agencies in Colorado, have they debruced at this point in time?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, I believe that was approximately the number. I know Dee Weiser is prepared to speak to that in doing some of that research. What he mentioned, we did talk to Dee for about half an hour, some staff preparing for this meeting, this ad hoc meeting. And he did name off approximately the same statistics that were mentioned last time, in which many of the jurisdictions, smaller jurisdictions, have been debruced. I think there were only 1 or 2 school districts that had not gotten voter approval for debrucing. He said it would be potentially a bigger challenge on a larger organization to get voters to approve a debrucing.
Okay, thanks. Well, aside from us starting the conversation, I'm not exactly sure what makes the most sense here to proceed.
Brendan's got his hand up, just in case he has info for us.
Okay, Brandon.
Hi, yes, thank you. I just spoke with Dee again. I guess best way I can communicate this information to the board office folks. He was able to dial in and listen, but he seems to be muted from the other end. So he's unable to unmute on his end. So if there's anything the board office.
I just unmuted him, so he should be good. Both should be good to go.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Dee. This is Bob Broom. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, can you all hear me?
We can.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hi, Bob. Good.
Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what role you play with RTD, and then initiate the discussion about when the Tabor Amendment was approved by the voters in Colorado, and what the recent history has been about agencies debrucing, so they wouldn't have to deal with the administrative overhead of keeping track of all this, and then perhaps trying to decide how to send out 50 cents per person or something like that, which doesn't make any sense.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. I'm Dee Weiser. I'm a partner with the law firm of Butler Snow in Denver. We are bond counsel to the district. I've worked on most all of the district's financing since about 1989. Hopefully on the phone as well, and with access to participate, is my colleague Dalton Kelly. Are you there, Dalton?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. So Tabor is about to turn 30 in November. It was passed by the voters as a constitutional amendment in 1992. As it relates to this conversation, Tabor in general limits the revenue growth of state and local governments in Colorado. For an entity like RTD, well, I should say that RTD is currently what is described as being debruced pursuant to the 1999 election and the 2004 election. But the 1990 election authorization for debrucing expires no later than December 31, 2026. What debrucing means is that the voters in RTD have opted out of the revenue limitation in Tabor, at least in part and partially temporarily. The revenue limitation, as broadly applicable to local governments like RTD, is that the revenue cannot grow from one year to the next by more than the amount of revenue collected in the prior year, adjusted for a percentage change in inflation and what's called local growth. Inflation is the percentage change in the Denver Boulder CPI. Local growth is defined by Tabor to be the net change in the actual value of real property in the district from construction of taxable real property minus minus any destruction of similar improvements. So it's this complicated analysis that the assessors have to assist with in terms of how much the value of property in the district changed from one year to the next. So rough justice, if a district was collecting $100 in 2001, and if inflation in 2001 were 3%, and if local growth were 2%, that means in 2022, the maximum allowed to be collected would be the $100 multiplied times 5%, so 105%. If the revenues exceed that calculation, then under Tabor's provisions, there has to be a refund made to taxpayers. And if revenues are less than that, then that could actually result in a decline in revenue in future years. Because
and the refund, excuse me for interrupting you here, but the refund could be in the form of additional services or something like that, as opposed to actually sending out cash.
Well, maybe let me finish how the revenues are calculated, and then we'll come back to the refund methodology. Basically, Tabor uses a phrase called fiscal year spending, but when you analyze it, it's really about revenues, and it's all of the revenues the district receives with some exceptions. Among those exceptions are federal funds, which is important obviously to RTD, damage awards, which would be if one of your buildings burned down, if one of your buses were damaged in an accident and it was the fault of somebody else and you got payment under their insurance for that, you could exclude that. If property is sold by the district, the sales of property is excluded. Voter approved revenue changes are excluded, but that's basically what we're talking about here in terms of debrucing. A voter approved revenue change is an authorization from the voters to collect some or all of the revenues being received. There are a few others, but they're not really relevant to RTD. So, Bob, to your point, refund methodologies, Tabor says that any reasonable refund methodology selected by the district is okay. And it says in particular that if you can't identify where the revenues came from, then you don't have to necessarily pay it back to a particular taxpayer. And in RTD's case, it's always going to be impossible really to figure out, in the context of the sales tax, who paid the sales tax. And the state of Colorado deals with this fairly regularly, and you probably know the state most years deals with Tabor refunds by way of an income tax credit. And there was a case in which some out-of-state taxpayers argued that was unfair to them. They should have gotten a refund as well, and the court agreed with the state and not with complaining taxpayers. A lot of governments in Colorado who are still subject to Tabor's revenue limits use a temporary property tax credit as a way of efficiently effectuating a refund, but since the district's not currently levying a property tax, that's not a viable option for RTD. It is the case that sometimes governments have actually written checks to taxpayers. And it is my understanding that most often that is a very expensive proposition. It costs usually more to process the checks than the amount of the refund. When Tabor, a couple years after Tabor first passed, Boulder County Schools, as I understand it, wrote checks to taxpayers, and I was told that it cost more than the refund. And Jefferson County, just this last year, wrote checks to taxpayers, and we could investigate further, but I'm assuming their experience is the same. As to your question specifically, Bob, about the payment for services, I guess maybe the way I would think about that is, in essence, you'd be providing people who want to ride the bus or the train a voucher to do that for free when it otherwise would have cost them to do so. It seems to me.
What about if
Go
you
ahead.
had a policy that during the ozone season, that for 2 or 3 months, that you would forego charging anybody fees to ride in order to entice people to leave their car at home and so forth?
Yeah, I think that likely works. And when I was talking about the voucher, I'm sorry, I wasn't really thinking you'd issue a voucher, but I was using that as an analogy. But effectively, if it was going to cost me as a senior citizen $2.50 to take the bus downtown, and I could do that for free, then you've refunded to me $2.50. But I do think there may be at least political backlash to that, not everybody who paid the taxes is getting the benefit of that. But again, going back to the state of Colorado case, that shouldn't be a problem. But it's pointed out that it could be something that will be of at least some controversy.
If I could piggyback on that one too, Mr. Director Broom.
Yes.
The other question, it sounds like it would fall within that same category, is we're going to go to more of an account-based system. Could we build in a balance for taxpayers that they could then activate the account and use that as their fare rather than a blanket free month or something like that?
Yeah, I think so, Shelley.
Earlier,
Go ahead, Bob.
Earlier, you spoke about an ad valorem tax and that RTD had never levied an RTD tax. Are we allowed to levy a ad valorem tax?
Under the statute, you do have statutory authority to levy up to 1/2 mil, but that has, as you say, not ever been exercised. Of course, under Tabor, that would require voter approval to go ahead and do that now. When the RTD statute was passed, voter approval wasn't required, but certainly under Tabor would be required today.
And there's specific language to that effect in the RTD or
Yeah,
where?
in the RTD statute. Yeah, it's in the RTD statute.
Okay, because
Probably.
when you form a new metro district and you levy that first tax, that is that also done by the voters?
Yeah, of course, it's easier in most of those
Yeah,
metro
right.
district situations because there's a small number of voters. But yeah, that is how it's done. That at the formation stage, there's an election to authorize that tax levy.
Okay, well, somewhere along the line, I'd like staff to take a look at the ad valorem tax and give us some kind of an idea of if you levied that tax, what it would generate. I don't know whether the information is available from the county assessors that would allow you to do that or not. I mean, you know, obviously they have to keep track of voters that vote in the district, but I don't know that they keep track of what, you know, but maybe in your some of your bond documents, you've put in some information on
I don't
assessed
recall
value.
that. Yeah, I don't recall whether that's true or not, but we can check that. But the relevant statute is in 32.9.120, which authorizes the levy of up to 1/2 mil. It's supposed to be used for operation and maintenance purposes.
Okay, let's stop here now and see, Shelley and I have asked questions that we've had, see if anyone else has any questions.
But maybe I could chime in on what I think I heard you asking when I was trying to join, and that's about other governments that have debruced. You know, in my experience, by and large, most of them have. Certainly, for example, in the Colorado school district realm, 177 of 178 are totally debruced. One district's just debruced as to its property taxes. Substantial number of municipalities are. Counties are probably more of a mixed bag, I think. Certainly, Jeffco is not totally debruced. I think El Paso County is not totally debruced. Maybe most relevant for RTD is that the Scientific and Cultural Affairs or Finance District, Scientific and Cultural Facilities District is debruced, but it's done so in multiple elections over the years that all had sunsets. I think they've had elections in 95, 2004, and 2016, and they're debrucing sunsets now in 2030.
Were their elections
Certainly,
were their elections real close? And is that why they keep putting the sunset in, is to make sure they, you know, that otherwise, if you do it once and get it over with, you wouldn't have to do that.
yeah, I don't recall anything about whether I don't recall the specifics of the vote tally, but I think in some ways it gets driven a little bit by political consultants who say that one thing voters like to see is a sunset on these various Tabor questions. And so that may be why it is so for SCFD. We see some districts, some governments have sunsets in their Tabor provisions. And in the debrucing context, it does raise this issue that, well, if you get to the end of the sunset period and you have a failed election, now you're back subject to the rules again. Also, in considering whether to have a debrucing question, some of them are very broad and say, essentially, can we keep and spend all the money we ever collect? Some of them are more narrow as to specific revenue streams. Sometimes, no matter which revenue stream is addressed, The purposes are limited. Although in your case, I would guess most likely you wouldn't limit the purpose other than more broadly as to transit, but I guess that's a possibility. You may recall that the voters of the state approved referendum C for the state of Colorado a few years ago, which was an interesting twist on Tabor in that it didn't totally debruce the state, but instead sort of reset the base for the state. And it was at a period of time when the state's revenues, when the state's Tabor limits were declining, and it basically said, for the next 5 years, the state can collect whatever monies it receives, and at the end of that 5 years, whatever the highest year was, that'll essentially be the base going forward to be adjusted by the Tabor growth formula. I guess the one thing related to the SCFD approach, which would be relevant to RTD, of course, is the relatively significant cost of conducting an election in a big district like yours. You're dealing with all the county clerks and having to pay their costs. So SCFD's made the decision they'll continue to do this every so many years and pay for those costs. But it's something the board should consider in making any choices about how to proceed with an election, is regardless of the outcome of the election, you'll have to pay your share of the cost. I guess maybe the last thing I'd point out is, you have to do these elections in November of any year. Most political consultants would say the best year to have a Tabor election
It's a
is
presidential.
a presidential election.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of the high voter turnout, and in particular the fact that more Democrats who are more likely favorable to tax and government spending will vote in a presidential year. A year like this year, 2021, is probably or 2023, with small voter turnouts, tend to be less favorable to those things.
Right.
And I guess maybe the last point I'd make is to think about where RTD's ballot questions would fall on the ballot. We're already hearing from a number of our clients in the RTD boundaries who are thinking about 2024 elections. Several of our school district clients are already sort of teeing that up. Under the Secretary of State's rules, RTD's questions would come after county measures, municipal measures, and school district measures. So if you think about a long ballot under those rules, your questions would be fairly down the list.
So I guess to follow up on what that might mean is that if it was kind of determined that the likelihood that we're going to have to make refunds is fairly low, and that those refunds are probably fairly low themselves, and there might be some way to direct the refunds during the ozone season or whatever thing else you came up with. It might be better just to manage it that way than going on the ballot, since you're going to be the very last thing on the ballot. And that's likely never to change. You're always going to run into this problem as to how many people are going to try to hit the ballot at a particular time.
Yeah, it is a challenge about competing measures. Sometimes it's helpful where everybody's singing off the same sheet music about their needs, but there's also kind of tax tolerance questions that voters have. And of course, the other thing we're seeing play out more frequently is more state level measures where particularly those who want to see less growth of government are taking measures to the ballot to reduce the state's income tax, to limit fees. We saw in the city and county of Denver 2 elections ago, I think, a measure to try and reduce the city's sales tax. Bob, you may have seen in your career efforts to try and exempt food from sales tax in various jurisdictions.
Yeah.
So you have all those kind of conflicting things to think about. I would say that Secretary of State rules are not, I mean, I guess to put it another way, you could advocate with the Secretary of State to change those rules. But the way I just recited it to you is the rules that exist today.
Yeah, those would be difficult, I would think, to get changed. Before I forget,
to your point about whether, yeah, go ahead.
The district still has some authorized but unissued bonds. Is it possible to extend this deadline out by issuing some of those bonds?
No, those bonds are from the Fast Tracks election, and the Fast Tracks election in 2004 exempted the 0.4% sales tax from Tabor's revenue limitations. The limitation we're worried about is the 0.6 base system revenues, and basically that only continues as long as the base system debt is outstanding. And Brendan or Doug could remind me of when that is, but in no event can it go past 2026.
And you know, obviously, we're not an enterprise fund because we don't get anywhere near enough revenue from riders to qualify by that measure.
Yeah. You know, the Tabor test is to be an enterprise. You meet 2 of the 3 prongs. You're government-owned. You can be a government-owned business, the running of a transit system. You have the power to issue revenue bonds, but where you run into problems is that Tabor says you can't receive more than 10% of your total revenues from state and local government grant sources, which I think includes your sales tax revenue.
Yes, right. Okay, I see Shelley Cook has her hand up.
Yeah, I had a couple quick things. So just to recap, you're certain it's property valuation plus inflation and not population. Does the population only apply to the state itself, or I'm not clear. I was reading the act. Okay.
Yeah, that's right, Shelley. It's population is the measure for the state, and student population is the measure for school districts. Otherwise, it's all other governments have this property tax-based approach or property value-based approach.
Even statutory cities and things like that. Same thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And actual value, is that just what the assessor puts on the statement? I mean, that's the accepted measure for actual value is what appears on the assessor record?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it is the case that the assessors will assist in that certification.
Okay. And last question. This had come through from a local elected official from one of the board members. And it was a suggestion that we look at seeing if the legislature would run legislation to set a ballot issue to debruce all transit agencies to whom the Tabor Act applies. Is that, I don't know if that's Michael Davies, would that from a legal standpoint, is that something that could be asked about?
No, it gets to be a little challenging because I think it would have to be a constitutional amendment because under Tabor's provisions, each agency itself has to go to its voters. The state can't ask everybody in the state can all these agencies keep and collect their revenue unless it's by amendment to Tabor itself? And as you probably recall, the voters a few years ago amended the Constitution in what was called raise the bar, and that means a constitutional amendment that amends Tabor requires a 55% vote. A constitutional amendment that just repeals parts of Tabor only requires a 50% vote. So maybe somebody would say, well, what we should do is just have a constitutional amendment that deletes the revenue limitation of Tabor that would only require a 50% vote, but that would apply to all governments, not just transit agencies.
And then you had some examples or characteristics of elections that had tended to prevail that we could learn from, go to school on.
Yeah, I think in some ways this is one, Shelley, where size matters. And the smaller the government, the more, in my experience, the more likely the success, and the bigger the government, maybe the less likely the success, which is why, the state has generally not had success on debrucing measures. The state has a few revenue streams that have been debruced, like the marijuana tax, for example. And then, of course, referendum C. The bigger, more conservative counties, certainly like Jeffco and El Paso, have had trouble with that. And it may be that at some point, RTD, if you want to think about doing a debrucing measure, would want to do some polling and our focus groups to try and measure what motivates voters in RTD. We can look at the SCFD questions, but I think they're all pretty much any revenue stream subject to a sunset.
And this is Dalton, and to Dee's point there, there may be a chance if you see what's important to the RTD voters. We've seen this with some debrucing questions, and it is debruce revenue to be used for X. And so if there was something hit a chord with RTD voters, that might be a route to go. The general debruce, if it polls well enough, is obviously probably the most useful. But municipalities across the state have kind of done a variety of debrucing certain revenue streams, or the revenue from the excess can be used for certain purposes. So that would be another something else to consider.
Dalton, I think there's a CML database that has a lot of these questions, at least the municipal questions in, which we could share with the staff. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I believe so. They have a lot of the questions, and then there's also a database that just has the overall pass-fail for municipalities, and they're to varying degrees, varying revenue streams, but the overall pass rate up till fall 2020 was 86.6% approval. So historically, debrucing questions have done pretty well, but as Dee mentioned, it's as the scale goes up with the size of the district up to the state level, there may be some differences there about success rate, but we can definitely share with the staff some different election questions that we've seen through the CML's resources or just our own.
Now, the cost of the election, as long as RTD has an election scheduled anyway for a particular time, the incremental cost for just adding this one question, how would you calculate how much that would cost, I wonder?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer to that. Maybe the staff could go back and see what the cost of conducting the fast track selection were. One thing the county clerks will want to get paid for is the district's share of the Tabor notice that gets mailed to all voters. Obviously the ballot is slightly longer because of RTD's question, but I don't have a good handle on the incremental cost, Bob.
Okay.
Yeah, and Bob, I
Go ahead.
apologize. So the way it usually works is you enter into your intergovernmental agreement with the county, and they lay out how the cost sharing is going to work there. And unfortunately, it's kind of done in a variety of ways versus, some have a specific cost for just the Tabor notice and stuff. Others, it's by, the size that the question takes on the ballot. And so it probably would not be uniform across your footprint, and it would just take looking at what those counties usually require under their intergovernmental agreements.
Okay, the other question before I forget it is what kind of a campaign did the Metro Drainage District run to increase their mill levy the last time around?
Well, they obviously had a Tabor election to increase that mill levy, and it was really to counteract the effects of how the Gallagher residential ratio had declined, had impacted the revenues they received from their limited mill levy. In terms of the specifics of how they conducted the election, did they have a citizens committee, political consultant, and all that? I don't know, and you all probably have to reach out to their staff about that.
Because they're a large district as well. I was just curious as to what their campaign, how they put it together and were successful, because obviously asking for a property tax increase is not very popular.
Right.
Okay, any other hands up? Oh, we got Brandon. Do you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Director Broom. Maybe a follow-on question for Dee to follow up on one of your earlier questions about our existing debt. Dee, given the fact that the current base system sales tax debt final maturity is in 2024, and I believe the T-Rex election allowed us to the debrucing to go into effect either after the final debt is repaid or the end of 2026, as you mentioned. Are we able to refund any of that remaining debt by a year or two? Is that a tool that's in our toolbox to stretch out or delay that end of the debrucing?
Yes, you could legally do that so long as you meet the Tabor test of being at a lower interest rate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I don't have a copy of the agenda. What's the next item, Shelley, that's on the agenda?
Yeah, actually, if I could quickly follow up on the question that Brendan asked, I had to leave the room. Other matters is what follows here. And then finally setting the next meeting date and adjournment.
Okay.
But Brendan, if I had to leave for a minute, but when I came back, you were asking whether we could extend the debrucing period through a refunding. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, essentially that is what I was asking. Right now, for our base system, the final sales tax bond matures in 2024, and it's my understanding the debrucing will end either at the end of that, after that final debt is repaid, which is right now scheduled for 2024, or the end of 2026, whichever is sooner. So my question to Dee was simply, can we refund a little bit of that old debt to stretch it out by another year or two? Is that a tool that we have in our toolbox? Should the board choose to do that, to delay that end of the debrucing?
And you could run the numbers on that to tell how that influences our midterm financial plan, et cetera. Okay,
We can do that, yes.
thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions for bond counsel? Then let's go to other matters. Typically, I'm accustomed to having staff come back at this point in time with some recommendations on how to proceed. You know, I mean, they may give us 3 or 4 ways to proceed forward and what their recommended way of doing it is. And then it'd be our job as a committee to sift through those and then make a recommendation, I guess, up to the finance committee. I think that's the way we have to operate. Or maybe we can go directly to the board, but we can cross that bridge when we get to it. So is there any objection to asking staff to do that?
No, I'm fine with that.
So that'll be the case then. Any other matters to bring before we adjourn? We have to set a next meeting.
General Manager CEO Johnson has her hand up.
Please.
Thank you very much, Director Broom and Directors Cook. In an effort to manage expectations, recognizing you put forward that you'd like staff to bring back recommendations, is it your expectation that that will occur at the next regularly scheduled ad hoc committee meeting?
Yes. And obviously, you know, there may be a situation where some of the ideas need to be combined or fine-tuned, or we need to check with bond counsel to see if, you know, if we could actually do what they're proposing and that type of thing. But I'd like to get this thing wrapped up.
No, thank you very much, Director Broom. Recognizing what you just outlined, we would probably have some other intermediary steps. And I just wanted to ensure that you were okay with us bringing back preliminary recommendations, recognizing there's more work to flesh those out to discern which ones are actually viable. So thank you very kindly. Mr. McLeod, do you have anything further?
Thank you, General Manager Johnson. Yeah, I think that's exactly right on point. There would be some additional work. Obviously, D. Weiser had mentioned polling, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of additional footwork and considerations to be discussed before we were to forward that on to the full Finance and Planning Committee.
Okay, great. We're aligned. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify, are you coming back to our committee and then we forward it to Finance and Planning? Is that the idea?
So Director Cook, if I may, Director Broom, yes, we
Yes.
would be bringing it to this committee, and then I believe you all would have conversations relative to it going to finance, or if it would go to the executive committee. But as Director Broom indicated, I think that's where we would shore that up so we could get that consensus of the board as we have talked about previously. Thank you.
Okay, next meeting, I guess if we follow our normal schedule, would be next month.
Yeah, Monday, June 13 at 3 p.m.
Yeah, that's open for me, so that works. Let's plan on doing that unless there's an objection for staff. Hearing no objection, we'll plan on meeting on June 13th. And I don't know where the problem is, but I don't seem to be getting the agendas for these meetings until either an hour before the meeting or something like that. I don't get a chance to absorb them. So I appreciate it if we could get the agenda out a week ahead of time. Thank you. Hearing no other and seeing no other hands up, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.